Welcome, fellow travelers, on this winding path. Ever feel like you're navigating a minefield where the biggest explosions are the ones you never even saw coming? They thought they had you pegged right, the quiet one, the pushover, the one who'd crumble under pressure. But here's the thing. Your greatest feat was letting them believe you were weak. While they were busy laughing, underestimating, and even mocking you, were silently forging your own inner strength, a weapon far more potent than any they could wield. Think about it, in the wild, it's not always the loudest roar that brings down the prey. Lions have their thunder, sure, but it's the owl gliding silently, patiently observing, that snatches its target before it even knows what's happening. That's the kind of game you've been playing on a deeper level. While they were busy grandstanding and flaunting their power, you were studying the terrain, waiting for the opportune moment, and then striking with a precision that left them questioning everything they thought they knew about you. And that's what really throws them for a loop. Not the setback, not the foiled plans, but the realization that you were never who they thought you were. You played the part, wore the mask, even let them believe you were the joke. But all along, you were the silent strategist, dismantling their illusions piece by piece. It's almost comical when you step back and look at it. They held strategy sessions, exchanged hushed whispers, even formed flimsy alliances, trying to figure you out while you were just sitting back thinking, oh, bless their hearts, they really think they're ahead. The punchline is on them, a dose of unexpected reality. That's why we're diving into this today. To explore how you managed to completely outmaneuver them and how your quiet strength flipped the script in ways they never saw coming. Because the truth is simple, you didn't just survive their attempts. You executed a masterclass in quiet resilience without even announcing your presence on the battlefield. First, you never brandished the obvious weapons. They were waiting for you to come out swinging loud and aggressive like most people do when they feel threatened. They assumed your weapons would mirror theirs: anger, vengeance, gossip, maybe even public outbursts. That's why they dismissed you as a threat. In their minds, strength only manifests in one way: loud, visible, and messy. But you never relied on those tired tactics, and that's what made you untouchable. Instead of wasting energy trying to prove yourself in the heat of the moment, you cultivated the kind of power they couldn't even comprehend: patience, foresight, and an unwavering spirit. These qualities might seem dull to the untrained eye, but they cut deeper than any blade they could have sharpened against you. While they were busy trying to push your buttons, waiting for that explosive reaction so they could say, "Aha, I knew it," you gave them nothing. And in giving them nothing, you gave yourself everything. You held your ground, conserved your energy, and kept your strategy under wraps. The ironic part is they mistook your restraint for weakness. They actually thought they were winning because you weren't reacting the way they expected. But the reality is, every time you refused to stoop to their level, you were honing your true power. You weren't losing ground. You were allowing them to exhaust themselves, expose their own motives, and reveal their entire game plan. That's what happens when you refuse to engage in their petty fights. You get to watch them self-destruct with their own weapons. What unsettles them now is the dawning realization that the strength they mocked was never meant to impress them. It wasn't for show. It was for survival, for endurance, for building something far more lasting than their fleeting schemes. They interpreted your silence as emptiness, but it was actually a vault. It was the sanctuary where you built the inner arsenal they couldn't recognize until it was too late. And when it finally dawned on them, they understood the truth. You weren't harmless. You were hidden. You weren't unarmed. You possessed the kind of weapons they couldn't defend against. You outwitted them by keeping your cards close to your chest, and when the moment arrived, the victory was already yours because they never saw the real battle unfolding. Second, they only saw the surface. You moved in the depths. They were so preoccupied with the surface of your life that they completely missed where the real action was happening. Most people only know how to fight on the visible battlegrounds, arguments, status, money, appearances. That's their whole world. If they can't see it, they don't believe it's real. But you were operating in a completely different dimension. In the depths where intentions take root, and where power isn't about performance but about essence. That's why they never stood a chance against you. They were judging the cover, but you were writing the entire story underneath. Every plot they hatched originated from a shallow place. They relied on cheap tricks, manipulation, and fleeting victories. But shallow things don't last. And they certainly can't withstand someone who lives in the depths. You possess the ability to sense things before they even surfaced. You could discern the energy behind actions before they manifested. By the time their plans reached the surface, you had already dismantled them in silence because you didn't wait for concrete evidence. You felt the undercurrent. That's what sets you apart. They believed they were sharp because they knew how to read faces, spread gossip, or gather superficial information. You delved deeper than that. You paid attention to the subtle shifts, the inconsistencies, the way their true nature revealed itself even when their words said something else. They couldn't hide from you because their own patterns betrayed them. And once you recognized those patterns, you understood exactly what they were going to do before they even made their move. This is what made you formidable without ever lifting a finger. You didn't need to engage in surface-level skirmishes because you had already struck at the root. You didn't waste time arguing with lies because you knew the truth would emerge when the foundation crumbled. You didn't need to prove anything because depth doesn't argue with shallowness. It simply outlasts it. That's why they're so bewildered right now. They can't understand how their energy is being depleted while yours continues to grow. They can't comprehend how their plans keep unraveling while you remain standing strong. It's because they kept fighting in the shallow end while you were anchored in the deep. They never realized that the depth you carry was the battlefield they couldn't even access. Third, you knew their pattern before they took their first step. What unsettled them most about you is that you were always several moves ahead without making a grand announcement. They fancied themselves clever, unpredictable, even untouchable in their actions. But the reality is nothing about them was novel to you. You had encountered their kind before, studied their recurring patterns, and understood the script they were following long before they conceived their next move. They thought they were being original, but you recognized every tactic as recycled behavior. That's why their surprises never landed. They were performing a show you had already seen. You didn't have to fight harder because you were fighting smarter. By observing without rushing to judgment, you learned what triggered them, how they behaved when no one was watching, and the exact cycle they would inevitably fall into. They thought they were ambushing you, but in reality you were simply allowing the inevitable to unfold. You knew their weaknesses weren't just fleeting habits. They were deeply ingrained anchors. And anchors don't vanish. They pull a person back into the same self-destructive loops every single time. All you had to do was wait and they would expose themselves. That's why their attacks didn't rattle you. When someone operates with such predictability, their power is inherently limited. They can only function within the confines of the same loop. But when you move with foresight, you step outside that loop. It's not that they couldn't touch you, it's that they never truly understood your vantage point. They were waging a war you had already moved beyond, which made them appear increasingly desperate with each passing attempt. What makes this even more impactful is that you didn't need to retaliate for them to lose. You simply needed to maintain clarity. When you can foresee what's coming, panic is replaced by preparation. You never had to waste energy on fear because you already knew the outcome before they even took their first step. And when someone lives in foresight, they can't be ensnared by short-sighted illusions. That's what rattled them, realizing too late that while they believed they were the puppet masters, they were merely repeating a pattern you had already mapped out. They were busy crafting a script, but you had already read the ending. They thought they were unpredictable, but you were always several steps ahead. And that is precisely why their game unraveled before it even truly began. Fourth, your mercy was a masked weapon. They never grasped that mercy has two sides. In their limited worldview, mercy looked like weakness, a tender heart, a timid spirit, a willingness to be walked all over. They mistakenly believed that patience meant you lacked the strength to push back. That forgiveness meant you were oblivious to the harm being inflicted. What they failed to see was that your mercy wasn't submission. It was a calculated strategy. It was the most potent weapon you possessed because it bought you time, while simultaneously exposing them for who they truly were. By holding back, you allowed them to grow comfortable. You provided them with the space to reveal their intentions without interruption. Every insincere smile, every calculated word, every act of betrayal, you allowed it to play out in full view. They mistakenly believed they were getting away with it because you weren't reacting. But what was actually happening is that you were gathering evidence both in the tangible world and on a deeper spiritual level. You didn't need to strike prematurely because you understood that the longer they carried on, the more they would incriminate themselves through their own actions. Mercy isn't the absence of power, it's the conscious control of power. Anyone can lash out in the heat of the moment, but it requires a different kind of strength to remain composed and allow events to unfold. You weren't in a rush to clear your name or prove your point because you understood that premature strikes lack precision. You chose patience, and patience honed the blade. When the time finally arrived for the truth to land, it wasn't you who had to swing wildly. The blow was precise, undeniable, and final because they had already set themselves up for it. This is why your mercy unsettled them more than anger ever could. Anger would have suggested to them that they were important enough to elicit a reaction. But mercy, on the other hand, conveyed that they were powerless because no matter what they hurled at you, you still possessed the authority to hold back. You allowed them to believe they were winning when in reality they were merely weaving their own downfall. And when it all came crashing down, the wound cut deeper because it wasn't your hand that delivered the blow. It was their own. That is the brilliance of your mercy. It wasn't softness, it was a carefully constructed disguise. It wasn't defeat, it was impeccable timing. They never realized that the rope you extended to them wasn't a gesture of kindness for their benefit. It was the space they needed to hang their own deception. Fifth, you survived in silence, then struck in revelation. They expected you to crack publicly, to scream, to fight, to beg for someone to hear your side of the story. That would have given them the satisfaction of thinking, "See, we finally got to them." But you denied them that victory by choosing silence. You didn't retaliate in the manner they anticipated because you understood that noise only entertains the opposition. Instead, you simply endured, and that act of survival became its own powerful testament. Day after day, breath after breath, your very existence contradicted their lies. They attempted to bury you under immense weight, yet you remained standing tall. That kind of endurance speaks volumes far louder than any defense you could have uttered. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was a calculated form of resistance. You understood that the truth didn't require a cheerleader or a billboard, it simply needed time. So you remained still, you weathered the shadows, and you allowed them to build their illusions higher and higher. The taller they built them, the harder they were going to fall. By waiting patiently, you allowed the revelation to strike not as a weak rebuttal, but as a clean and decisive execution. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't stumble out of your mouth in frustration. It hit like a sniper shot, precise, undeniable, and devastating. That revelation wasn't just about clearing your name. It dismantled entire structures they had constructed around your supposed weakness, your alleged guilt, and your perceived failure. A single moment of truth shattered months or even years of carefully crafted lies. The beauty of it was in the precision. No wasted effort, no squandered energy, just a single irrefutable revelation that brought everything crashing down at once. What unsettled them most is how you allowed time to do the fighting for you. They can explain away arguments. They can twist words to suit their narrative. They can ignore protests. But they cannot erase the tangible evidence of survival. They cannot argue against the truth that emerges on its own terms with its own authority and in its own perfectly orchestrated timing. By refusing to engage in a messy struggle with them, you ensured that when the strike finally landed, it wasn't just a superficial wound. It was a complete and utter collapse. The illusions they had worked so diligently to maintain crumbled instantly because the one thing they couldn't destroy was the undeniable proof of your endurance. You survived in silence, and that survival was the setup. The revelation was the strike, and it left no room for debate. Sixth, you never matched their frequency. You erased it. They continuously tried to drag you into a fight that wasn't yours to begin with. Every jab, every insult, every meticulously planned setup was designed to provoke you into reacting in the way they understood best: loud, defensive, messy, and predictable. That's the only kind of battle they know how to wage, ego pitted against ego, pride battling pride. But you refused to participate on that frequency. You didn't mirror their chaos. And in doing so, you didn't just evade the trap, you erased the entire game from existence. The most powerful move was simply refusing to react on their level at all. When someone hurls negativity your way and you reflect it back, you're perpetuating the same destructive cycle. But when you refuse to even register on their radar, their energy not only loses its potency, it vanishes into nothingness. That's precisely what you did. You didn't win the fight because you never even acknowledged that there was a fight to begin with, and that is what truly broke them. They couldn't fathom how someone could absorb their blows without being drawn into their drama. They desperately wanted to control the narrative, but you deleted the stage they had built for it. Without your participation, their tactics became nothing more than background noise. What they perceived as sharp strategy was exposed as embarrassing desperation. You didn't counter their accusations with counter-accusations. You didn't engage in their gossip with more gossip. You didn't respond to their shade with equal shade. And that deliberate absence of reaction exposed them more brutally than any heated confrontation ever could. The most unsettling realization for them was that their usual tools, intimidation, manipulation, provocation, had absolutely no effect on you. It was as if they were throwing punches into thin air. No matter how hard they swung, there was nothing to hit, nothing to grab onto, nothing to drain. They expected you to fight back with fire, but you fought with absence. And absence is terrifying to people who thrive on attention. By erasing their frequency, you forced them to confront themselves. Without your energy to bounce off of, all they had left was their own reflection. That's why they unraveled. It wasn't because you shouted them down or publicly humiliated them. It was because you refused to exist on the same wavelength. You became the static that canceled out their signal. And in that silence, their power crumbled. You didn't match them. You didn't lower yourself. You erased the entire channel they were broadcasting on. And in the end, that was the most lethal strike you could have delivered. Seventh, you weaponized their obsession with you. They couldn't take their eyes off you. Every move you made, every word you spoke, every seemingly insignificant decision became their full-time obsession. They were fixated on deciphering you, trying to anticipate your next move, analyzing every detail as if you were some unsolvable enigma. What they failed to grasp was that their obsession wasn't a weapon they could use against you. It was a weapon in your hands. Every moment they spent fixated on you was energy they could have channeled elsewhere. But instead they poured it into confusion, frustration, and obsessive overthinking. You didn't need to actively push them into traps. Their own preoccupation dug the holes they ultimately fell into. The more they attempted to control the narrative surrounding you, the more they inadvertently revealed about themselves. Their hidden motives, deep-seated insecurities, and clandestine agendas became glaringly obvious because their entire focus was consumed by you. By obsessively scrutinizing your behavior, they exposed their underlying patterns and vulnerabilities without you even having to lift a finger. You became a mirror reflecting not just who you are, but who they are, consumed by greed for control. Desperate for understanding and tragically blind to their own glaring weaknesses, that reflection was sharper and more impactful than any argument or confrontation you could have initiated. Obsession is an exhausting endeavor, and they failed to recognize this. Every sleepless night, every whispered conversation, every overanalyzed scenario gradually drained their energy reserves. They persistently attempted to pull you into their twisted world. But the more they fixated on you, the less they had left to invest in their own schemes. You skillfully allowed their insatiable need to study, track, and decode you to become their undoing. You didn't actively strike. You simply allowed the natural consequences of their all-consuming obsession to dismantle them slowly, quietly, and irreversibly. By choosing to do nothing, you created everything. While they firmly believed they were hunting, plotting, and planning against you, they were unwittingly walking deeper and deeper into the repercussions of their own fixation. Their obsession inadvertently became a tool of justice, a self-inflicted collapse from which they couldn't escape. The beauty of this lies in the fact that you didn't have to lift a finger. You didn't need to publicly expose them, manipulate them, or seek retaliation. Their own misdirected energy accomplished it all for you. You effectively weaponized their obsession, not with aggression, but with calculated restraint. Their fixation, intended to control you, instead ended up controlling them. Every plan they hatched, every scheme they devised, every attempt to destabilize you, ultimately revealed their own inherent weaknesses. They couldn't stop themselves from looking, and in the end it was that very inability to look away that ensured their inevitable downfall and your silent victory. Eighth, they thought you were playing checkers. You were rewriting the game. They believed everything was predictable, that life followed the same basic rules they lived by. They thought conflicts, confrontations, and schemes were like a simple game of checkers, one move at a time, reactive, obvious, and easy to foresee. This is precisely what made them so overconfident. They assumed that by closely observing your every move, dissecting every choice, and predicting your reactions, they could always maintain the upper hand. What they failed to grasp is that you weren't playing by their rules at all. You weren't even participating in the game they thought existed. Instead of reacting piece by piece, you shifted the entire system from the ground up. You rewrote the unspoken rules of engagement without announcing it, without making a show of it, and without allowing them to witness the subtle shift until it was far too late. Every move they meticulously calculated was designed for a familiar checkerboard, but you had already constructed a brand new arena, one where their well-worn strategies were rendered useless. One where their predictable patterns failed to land with any impact. They were diligently planning attacks, plotting elaborate defenses, and meticulously analyzing your behavior, completely oblivious to the fact that the board they were so intently focused on no longer existed. By the time they finally realized what had transpired, they were hopelessly trapped by their own outdated assumptions. Every tactic they had previously relied on to control, manipulate, or predict you became utterly useless. Their past victories transformed into resounding defeats because the very foundation of the game had been quietly replaced while they were still clinging to the illusion that they were in control. You weren't simply winning against them. You were systematically dismantling the entire way they understood reality, leaving them scrambling to adapt to rules they never even saw being written. The brilliance of this maneuver is subtle yet devastating. They never suspected that you were operating on a plane of existence far beyond their limited comprehension. You didn't need to confront them head-on. You didn't need to prove yourself in the way they expected you to. By refusing to play their outdated game and instead creating your own entirely new one, you ensured that every attempt they made to outmaneuver you only propelled them closer to their own inevitable failure. When the climactic moment arrived, it wasn't just a game they lost. It was the shattering realization that the familiar battlefield they thought they controlled had completely vanished. They had already been checkmated long before they even understood that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. And in that deafening silence, the victory was complete because they never learned the rules of the elevated arena you had mastered, leaving them powerless, vulnerable, and utterly exposed. Ninth, you struck their spirit, not just their plans. Most people tend to react only to what they can readily perceive: the spoken words, the whispered gossip, the blatant betrayals, the obvious schemes that are easy to identify and dissect. They measure victory by how effectively they can thwart specific actions or punish tangible mistakes. That's precisely why they thought they could corner you. They genuinely believed that if they dismantled the visible aspects of your life, controlled the prevailing narrative, or manipulated external outcomes, they could ultimately defeat you. But you operate on an entirely different level. You don't merely combat what manifests on the surface. You target the underlying source, the driving force, the very spirit fueling the specific actions. That's precisely why everything they painstakingly built inevitably fell apart often, without them ever grasping a clear explanation for the sudden collapse. You understood that deceptive plans, malicious lies, and acts of deliberate sabotage are merely symptoms of a much deeper issue. The true power lies in the underlying root, the initial intent, and the overall energy that propels each individual move. While they were laser-focused on the surface, desperately hoping to trip you up or catch you in a compromising reaction, you were skillfully discerning the true source of their destructive patterns. You pierced through the puppet to target the puppeteer, addressing not the fleeting maneuvers but the very essence that powered them. Every plot they hatched with such confidence inevitably crumbled because it lacked any inherent vitality once its driving force was effectively confronted. This unique approach grants you an advantage that is both invisible and unstoppable. They can hurl elaborate schemes at you, manipulate circumstances to their advantage, and even gather a formidable coalition of allies to stand against you. But if the core spirit driving their attacks is effectively neutralized, the entire surface structure crumbles on its own. What may appear as utter chaos to outside observers is actually a precise and surgical strike at the very core of the issue. You don't need to chase after every single action or waste precious energy on every minor maneuver. The ultimate collapse happens naturally once the true source has been properly addressed. The brilliance of this method lies in the fact that it is inherently unpredictable. They can see you clearly. They can hear your every word. They can actively attempt to provoke you. But they cannot possibly see the intricate spiritual alignment that guides your considered responses. That powerful alignment allows you to strategically act where they simply cannot reach, and to dismantle what they mistakenly believe to be completely safe. They become hopelessly trapped within their own elaborate mechanisms because the underlying fuel that once powered them has been effectively drained. By striking at the spirit rather than merely reacting to the surface, you ensure that their attacks are ultimately temporary, inherently ineffective, and self-defeating. They firmly believed they were in complete control, confidently shaping external outcomes, but they never grasped the profound reality that you were skillfully operating on a higher plane where their petty plans simply couldn't survive. The inevitable moment of collapse isn't a violent explosion. It's a quiet yet undeniable inevitability. Their intricately controlled puppets ultimately fall because the controlling puppeteer has already been expertly disarmed, leaving you untouched, unburdened, and completely unchallenged. 10th, you killed the illusion, not the person. You didn't retaliate against them in the way that most people perceive power being exerted. You weren't interested in seeking petty revenge, publicly humiliating them, meting out severe punishment, or breaking them down physically. That's a superficial and ultimately fleeting kind of attack that anyone can readily attempt. What you accomplished was far more precise and infinitely more permanent. You strategically targeted the core illusions they had come to rely on so heavily. The carefully crafted false narratives they had built around themselves, the blatant lies they willingly told others, the unearned authority they arrogantly assumed. Without any legitimate basis, you systematically dismantled the very foundations that provided them with a false sense of confidence, influence, and unwarranted control. By skillfully removing the carefully constructed illusion, you effectively exposed them for who they truly were at their core. They had painstakingly constructed entire worlds out of intricate deception, carefully arranging fabricated stories, manufactured personas, and calculated manipulations in order to convince everyone, including themselves, that they were somehow untouchable. They wholeheartedly believed those flimsy illusions were solid and impenetrable, that they served as powerful shields against inevitable exposure and ultimate failure. But manufactured illusions, no matter how elaborate or carefully constructed, cannot possibly withstand the discerning gaze of someone who sees with absolute clarity and steadfastly refuses to be distracted by fleeting surface appearances. You didn't need to utterly destroy them. You simply dismantled the elaborate fiction they desperately hid behind, the false power, the feigned respect, the meticulously manufactured dominance. All of it crumbled under its own considerable weight the very moment it was confronted with the stark and unwavering truth. That's what makes your purposeful strike simultaneously invisible yet utterly devastating. They weren't irreparably harmed by a heated confrontation or a scandalous public exposure. They were instead left standing precariously in a vast and unfamiliar space where the deceptive rules they had been so diligently playing by no longer applied. Their carefully manufactured influence swiftly faded away. Their unwavering confidence faltered and cracked, and suddenly their carefully constructed life had no true anchor to hold it in place. By skillfully killing the carefully constructed illusion instead of the actual person, you ensured that nothing truly vital or essential was destroyed in the process, just the intricately layered structures that had been precariously built upon a foundation of intentional deception. It's akin to a surgical strike, clean, precise, and leaving behind undeniable clarity in the very place that was once clouded by chaos and intentional misdirection. What's truly remarkable about this insightful and effective method is that it doesn't create enduring enemies in the traditional sense. It doesn't incite vengeful retaliation because you never directly attacked the core of their being. You simply removed the carefully crafted falsehoods they had come to rely on, and once those flimsy falsehoods inevitably crumbled, their deeply ingrained ability to act from a contrived position of artificial power naturally dissipated. They had nothing substantive left to manipulate, no unearned authority to wield, no compelling narratives to forcefully defend. By strategically killing the carefully constructed illusion, rather than the intrinsic person, you left them exposed, powerless, and undeniably human, while you simultaneously remained untouched, unburdened, and skillfully operating from a position of unwavering truth and authentic alignment. That is the very essence of being a skilled strategist, striking with laser-like precision at what truly matters, not at what is merely visible and fleeting, leaving lasting clarity and enduring justice in place of what was once calculated deception and elaborate falsehood. 11th, they realized too late that innocence was camouflage. They looked at you and saw mere softness, inherent vulnerability, even a perceived simplicity. They arrogantly assumed that your outward innocence was a telling weakness, irrefutable proof that you didn't fully comprehend the deceptive games they so readily played, that you were therefore easily manipulated and effortlessly controlled. That fateful assumption was their first and most critical mistake. What they utterly failed to understand is that your outward innocence wasn't rooted in inherent ignorance. It was instead a deliberate and skillfully constructed shield, a form of effective camouflage that cunningly concealed the profound depth of your astute awareness and the unwavering strength of your steadfast resolve. While they remained narrowly focused on what they mistakenly perceived as your intrinsic vulnerability, you were skillfully operating from a strategic space they could neither actively access nor adequately anticipate. Your inherent purity allowed you to move freely in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. It gave you unwavering clarity amidst utter chaos, a heightened level of discernment that stemmed from intrinsic alignment rather than inflated ego. While they wasted their time trying to actively manipulate, intentionally deceive, or exert misguided control, you remained fundamentally untouchable because you simply weren't competing on their baser level. You weren't merely reacting to their inherent distortions. You were calmly observing, skillfully calculating, and strategically acting from a place that conveyed undeniable higher authority. They couldn't possibly grasp it because their twisted perception of legitimate power was inherently tied to misguided dominance and unwarranted aggression, while your unwavering power was inextricably tied to authentic alignment and unwavering intention. The looming danger they never saw coming was that your authentic innocence gave you direct access to powerful forces they couldn't even begin to comprehend. It wasn't about being naive or inherently passive. It was about being intrinsically pure enough to skillfully convey unadulterated truth without any form of internal distortion. That innate cleanliness amplified your potential power because it wasn't diluted by inflated ego-lingering resentment or the incessant need to constantly prove yourself. Every move you made was purposeful, precise, undeniably intentional, and skillfully backed by a source of unwavering strength they couldn't possibly influence. By the time they finally realized the hard truth, it was already far too late for them to rectify their mistake. The very thing they readily mocked, significantly underestimated, and arrogantly assumed they could readily exploit your inherent purity became the most lethal and devastating weapon in your highly effective arsenal. They mistakenly thought they were actively contending with someone intrinsically weak and remarkably predictable. Instead, they were unwittingly facing a formidable force that skillfully operated on a strategic level. They could never hope to penetrate a quiet force that was artfully hidden behind a carefully constructed mask of disarming innocence. Your skillful camouflage ensured that every deliberate attempt they made to actively control or overtly expose you ultimately failed. They belatedly discovered that the outwardly soft exterior skillfully concealed absolute precision, profound spiritual authority, and an intrinsic level of strength they simply couldn't accurately measure. Authentic innocence wasn't an inherent flaw. It was, in fact, the ultimate strategy for skillfully navigating the complex terrain of life. And in that earth-shattering realization, they finally understood that what they had so readily dismissed as utterly harmless was in undeniable truth completely untouchable and utterly unstoppable. 12th, you didn't fight for victory, you became victory. They presumptuously thought they could measure inherent success by forcibly drawing you into a fabricated fight, by purposely pushing you into a contrived race where winning solely meant proving an artificial dominance over one another. That's the only kind of limited game they inherently know: constant struggle, unwarranted resistance, empty ego-driven victories. But you consciously chose to never play by their twisted rules. You didn't actively fight for a fleeting victory because you skillfully understood something they couldn't possibly see. True victory isn't a limited goal to actively chase. It's a powerful state to fully embody. You didn't need to outwardly react, actively argue, or inherently prove anything to anyone. You skillfully became the very proof itself by consciously embodying undeniable victory. You effectively removed the superficial battlefield from meaningful existence. When someone skillfully carries the powerful essence of inherent triumph within their very being, superficial conflict loses its contrived meaning. The manipulated outcomes they were desperately trying to artificially manufacture no longer applied because your ingrained victory wasn't something you actively achieved externally. It was something that was already intrinsically inherent in who you authentically were. They could still actively attempt to launch misguided schemes, spread malicious lies, or engage in calculated manipulations. But none of it could ever touch the profound reality that your intrinsic alignment, unwavering clarity, and unparalleled resilience had already rightfully claimed the ultimate prize. That's precisely why their ill-fated efforts consistently fell utterly flat. They actively tried to corner you, purposely push you into reactive responses, and strategically draw you into meaningless arguments. But every single attempt collided with your inherent calm and steadfast, unshakable certainty. You weren't actively fighting in the superficial arena they were childishly imagining, because you had skillfully left it far behind the very moment you realized that genuine power doesn't ever need external validation. The fabricated victory they so desperately sought to forcibly take from you didn't inherently exist on their predefined terms. It authentically existed in the undeniable fact that absolutely nothing they actively did could ever alter your carefully chosen trajectory. When someone consciously becomes inherent victory itself, shallow battles effectively collapse before they even meaningfully begin. Their meticulously crafted plans, painstakingly plotted and carefully rehearsed, suddenly seem utterly irrelevant and meaningless. They frantically scramble to find some semblance of leverage, but that elusive leverage simply isn't there because the inherent outcome has already been skillfully embodied within you. They can't ever defeat what is already inherently whole, genuinely complete, and authentically aligned with a much higher purpose. They can actively try to bend reality around their misguided expectations, but it resolutely refuses to yield because your hard-earned victory isn't artificially conditional on outward circumstance. It's an unshakable and undeniable truth. This is the quiet devastation they never saw coming their way. They were utterly obsessed with actively outmaneuvering you, purposely proving their artificial superiority and actively claiming a contrived win. But you inherently didn't need to actively play their superficial game. You weren't merely reacting defensively, proving, or childishly chasing after anything. You simply skillfully existed, authentically aligned and unwavering in your chosen purpose. And that mere existence made genuine victory inherently inevitable. They were never truly fighting a human person. They were instead actively contending with the undeniable reality that you had already skillfully become. 13th, you erased their ability to predict you. Their unearned confidence stemmed from recognizable patterns. They inherently relied on calculated predictability, the instinctive way that most people react under pressure. The established habits that repeatedly surface, the easily predicted emotions, and the inherent weaknesses that virtually everyone inevitably carries. That calculated predictability was their primary source of misdirected power. It allowed them to actively manipulate external outcomes, skillfully anticipate calculated responses, and effectively control predetermined situations. But you inherently didn't readily fit into their shallow patterns. You weren't outwardly reactive in the predictable way they had carefully anticipated. You didn't blindly follow the established script they presumptuously assumed that everyone willingly played by. And the pivotal moment they realized that profound truth, everything they had meticulously relied on began to irreparably collapse. You skillfully made calculated unpredictability your primary weapon of choice. Every conscious choice, every measured response, and every deliberate step you purposefully took was carefully calculated, but not in a way they could possibly foresee. They couldn't accurately calculate your carefully considered reactions because there was simply no rigid formula to blindly follow, where they fully expected inherent fear. Deliberate hesitation or uncontrolled anger, you instead purposefully offered unwavering clarity and deliberate composure. Where they confidently expected inherent desperation or ego-driven mistakes, you instead skillfully offered calm and unwavering precision. By resolutely refusing to merely exist within the narrow confines of their predefined expectations, you effectively removed the underlying foundation of their unwarranted control. Their carefully constructed strategies, meticulously built on empty repetition and faulty assumption, inevitably failed because they falsely assumed that you were just another predictable piece on their shallow checkerboard. Skillful unpredictability isn't rooted in utter chaos. It's deliberate discipline skillfully applied with heightened awareness. You deliberately trained yourself to skillfully act from inherent alignment rather than mere unthinking reaction. You consciously didn't react merely for the sake of triggering a thoughtless reaction. And that deliberate silence in your carefully considered movement ultimately left them exposed and utterly vulnerable. They foolishly thought they were actively leading, but in undeniable truth, they were merely chasing fleeting shadows, frantically scrambling to actively keep up with someone they simply couldn't accurately map or strategically predict. Every ill-fated attempt to actively corner you inevitably became undeniable proof of their own inherent blindness. The most devastating part for them is that calculated predictability had always been their ill-conceived safety net. Once that flimsy safety net disappeared from beneath their feet, they inherently had nothing of substance left to actively hold on to. They could no longer actively anticipate your thoughtfully chosen moves, could no longer actively manipulate external outcomes, and could no longer inherently rely on the familiar human patterns that commonly give unwarranted power to manipulative people. You weren't merely avoiding their carefully laid traps. You deliberately dismantled the very system that allowed such misguided traps to meaningfully exist in the first place. By skillfully erasing their very ability to effectively predict you, you forcefully took away their unwarranted advantage long before the superficial fight even actively began. They were operating with nothing more than flawed assumptions while you were purposefully moving with undeniable authority. Their ill-conceived plans inevitably crumbled because calculated predictability was their primary tool, and you skillfully ensured that such a flawed tool no longer possessed any relevance or inherent power. In the long run, the misguided chaos they so readily feared wasn't purposefully